Hey everyone, welcome back to more exciting Simple Trader application development. Today what I want to do is I want to start displaying account information to the user, such as how much money they have and some of the assets that they own. Now to do that, what we are going to need to do is actually manage more application state. And I've set up some UML diagrams to represent what I need to do here. So we have this account store from last episode, and that stores the current account for the application. And our authenticator uses that store to set the current account after the user logs in, and then remove the current account when they log out. Now what we need to do is we need to add another store, and this is going to be for assets, and it's going to use the account store, and it's going to use the account store to get the account balance and the account asset transactions, and then view models can subscribe to this asset store and get this data and update how they use the data whenever it changes with this StateChanged event. And I represent my events in UML with just a $sign. I don't know if there's any standardized way to do this, but you can kind of make it up as you go, as long as everyone that you work with understands what the heck is going on. But anyways, the beauty of using events for all this is that it's all going to be super reactive, and everything in our application is just going to update automatically because we're going to subscribe to all of the events, and that'll propagate all the data to our UI and keep everything in sync. So let's go ahead and actually implement this. So the first thing we're going to create is that store that we talked about. Let's create a new folder in our state folder, and this is going to be assets. And inside here we are just going to have a new class, and this is going to be an asset store. And I'm not going to interface this because I don't feel like I need to, but if you feel the need to create an interface for your asset store, go right ahead, but I can't see myself really swapping this out in the future. But I could be wrong, who knows, but for now, I'm just going to go with a hard implementation. Now this asset store, as we mentioned, is going to use our account store. So let's add the account store, and let's create a constructor for that, because we are going to register this with our dependency injection container and get this account store for our application. Now our asset store also needs to actually provide data to the people that have access to the store, and that is going to be the account balance, and that's just going to be a getter, and it's going to use our account store, get the current account, and get the balance. Now the issue with this is that the current account could be null, because there could potentially be no user logged into the application, and that would be bad. So what we can do is put a question mark after current account, and what that simply means is that if the current account is null, it's not going to check the balance, and it's just going to simply return null from this getter. But that's a problem in our case because doubles cannot be null. They aren't nullable values. So what we can do at the end of this is provide a fallback value if this evaluates to null, and our fallback value can just be 0. So now this is 100% safe. We're not going to get nasty null pointers. So we're going to do something similar for our asset transactions. So let's display them, create a property. Going to be a read-only property, of course, because we are using our account store. And this is going to use the current account again, add the question mark. Let's get those asset transactions, and if that evaluates to null, let's just provide an empty list of asset transactions. There we go. So that is the data that we are going to be providing from our asset store. And let's create an event that other classes can subscribe to whenever any of the state changes. And this is just going to be an action, so you subscribe with a method that returns void and takes no parameters, and this is just going to be StateChanged. Now keep in mind, I hate to say it, but this is kind of like a lazy way to do it. You might want to have separate events for each piece of state that changes. So you might want to have account balance changed, asset transactions changed. But for our case, we're keeping it simple, and we're just going to have one event because I think that is enough for our use case. So now we actually have to raise this event, and when are we going to raise this? Well, whenever the account changes in the account store, then we're going to raise this StateChanged event. But if we look at our account store, we don't have a StateChanged event to subscribe to. So let's go into our account store and let's create this. event that we can subscribe to. And we did talk about this last episode, how we might potentially add this event, and here we are, we're adding it because we need it. So let's just take that, move that into our actual account store, and this is going to have to be a full property, so I'm just going to generate this with my good old prop change snippet. It's going to be an account, same thing as before, except what we're going to do instead is raise StateChanged whenever the setter gets called. So let's invoke that, and there we go. So now our account store is looking good. So back in our asset store, we can subscribe to that event. So whenever the account state changes, we are going to create an event handler, and we're just going to call this onStateChanged. And let's generate that method. So whenever the account state changes, we're going to invoke our own StateChanged event. So same thing as always. And there we go. So anyone can use this asset store and grab this information, use it however they want, and they can subscribe to the StateChanged event, and they'll be able to receive updates, and then they can re-grab this data and recalculate it however they need to, and everything will be in sync. So now that we have that, we are ready to use this asset store. So how are we going to use this? Well, let's create a view model, and I'm going to call this the asset summary view model. So it's just going to have simple information about the user's assets. So we're going to make this a view model base, and while I'm here, I actually want to get rid of observable object, and this is just a model that implements iNotify property changed, but really I want to move all of this to view model base, because in my opinion, if you implement iNotify property changed, then you are a view model. That's the way that we are handling things in our application. So we no longer need this observable object, so we can just delete this whole folder. And there we go. And I think that breaks a few things because we don't have this namespace anymore. So we're going to have to go through and remove this namespace wherever we reference it. So there we go, that's one. We'll have to find the other ones as we go. So now our asset summary view model, it is going to use that asset store that we just set up. So let's create a field for that. And let's generate a constructor so that we can get that. We'll register this with our dependency injection container. We're going to have to set up all that in just a second. But now we have the asset store, and now we're ready to use that store to display some data. So what do I want to display on this view model? Well, I want to display the account balance, of course. And to do that, we're just going to use our asset store and get the account balance. And then I also want to display the assets that the user has. So to do that, we're going to have to be a little bit fancy, because if we look at asset transactions, these are just the transactions. So we're going to have to actually group these all together and calculate how many shares the user actually owns. So we can't just, well, I guess we could just display all these, but that's not what I want to display on this view model. I want to actually show, like, this is the symbol and this is how many shares you own. So what we're going to do is create a new view model that is going to show that information. So I'm just going to call this the asset view model, and all it's going to have is two properties. So like I said, I want to be able to show the symbol of the asset, so this can just be a read-only property, and I also want to show how many shares the user owns for this symbol. And to get these values, we're going to get those from the constructor. So let me just generate that and move that down here. And that's all we have to do for this asset view model. So it just takes in the data, and it's one time set, and it'll just display it however we need to. So keep in mind, we also don't need any iNotify property changed because it only gets set one time. So now that we have this view model, let's go ahead and use it in our asset summary view model. So we are going to display this using an observable collection, of course. So let's bring that in here, and this is going to be a collection of that asset view model. And we'll just call this assets. And then I'm going to provide these assets to the view with a property, of course, so that we can actually display them on the UI. But I'm going to only expose it as an enumerable so that no one can add or remove or set the assets from outside of this asset summary view model. So this is just some encapsulation. So let's make this an enumerable of asset view models. We'll just call this assets, and it's just going to provide the assets observable collection. So that's great. Now what we need to do is actually calculate these assets. So what we need to do down here is, first off, we need to initialize this observable collection because right now it's null. That's not okay. So there we go, we got that. And now we need to subscribe to our asset store. And whenever the state changes, we need to do some things. So the first thing we need to do is actually raise onPropertyChanged for our account balance. And then we also need to recalculate these assets. So what we're going to do is actually move this into its own method. We'll call this resetAssets. And let's generate a method for that. I'm actually going to move this up like that. And the first thing we're going to do is calculate these asset view models. So let's put that into a variable. And this is going to be the asset view models. And to calculate this, we're going to use our asset store, of course, because that's where our asset transactions are located. And now we need to calculate these into asset view models. So the first thing I want to do is group all of our assets, or all of our asset transactions, and I want to group them by symbol. So to do that, we can do this little lambda. So we're going to group our transactions by asset symbol. And now that we have them all in groups, we can select these groups into a new asset view model. And this constructor, the first parameter is the symbol. And since we grouped by symbol, we can get that symbol by taking the group key. So the key for our group is the symbol. And then the shares, we can take our group and do a sum. Inside here, we can specify how we want to summarize our asset transactions. So we want to summarize the amount of shares on the asset transactions in each group. So to do that, we can take our asset transaction and we can just get the shares. And this will return the total shares in the group of asset transactions for a symbol. But we actually have a problem here, because if we look at, let me bring up asset transactions. As you can see, we have this isPurchase flag. So an asset transaction could be a user selling shares. So we need to account for that when we calculate the total shares. So to do that, we can check if it was a purchase, then we are going to sum the shares. But if it wasn't a purchase, then we're going to sum the negative of the shares. So we're just going to be subtracting shares because they sold them. And now that we have these asset view models, let's go ahead and update our collection of asset view models. So let's clear the old one. And let's just iterate over our asset view models and add them to our observable collection. So let's get the asset view model. We'll just call this view model. And for each view model, we're just going to add it to our assets. Now keep in mind, we don't have to actually call onPropertyChanged or do anything like that, because we don't actually set this observable collection to a new value. And then since we use the same instance and it's an observable collection, the UI will automatically receive updates whenever we change the collection by adding or clearing elements. And that's actually everything I think we need for our asset summary view model. So let's go into our home view model, and this is where I want to use this asset summary view model. So let's create a property for that, the asset summary view model, and this can just be a read-only getter property, and we can actually do the same thing for our major index listing view model as well, because we just set these properties one time in the constructor. So let's get our asset summary view model in the constructor, and let's simply set it. And that's great. So that's everything for the home view model. Now we just need to update our dependency injection container. So we're already getting errors, and that's because our home view model needs that asset summary view model. So let's get that. So let's get required services, and we need the asset summary view model. Now, of course, if we want to get that, we're going to have to register it. So let's register a singleton for the asset summary view model. And if we want to do that, as we recall, the asset summary view model needs an asset store, so we need to register our asset store. So let's go ahead and do that down here with our other stores. And there we go. One thing to note is that our dependency injection container is actually kind of nasty, and I do want to clean this up in the future, clean up these factory implementations as well, and just make it look nicer and easier to read. Probably move it to its own class as well, but we'll do that in the future. And in the meantime, I think we're ready to test this out. So let's go into our asset summary view model, put a breakpoint right here, and make sure our assets look good, and that they also update whenever we purchase a stock. And like I mentioned, we do get errors because we deleted that model's namespace. So let's update that everywhere we had it. And now we're ready to test. Okay, so we log in, and we hit this reset assets because we are in this constructor right now. So let's just step over all of this and let's look at our assets. So if we look at this, we have 6 shares of T, so that's great. It looks like this is correctly calculating. Of course, I haven't sold anything, so that would be nice to test. Maybe I should hard code that into the database. And we actually hit this breakpoint again because I made other purchases earlier when I was testing this. And I was a little bit worried here. I thought this was calling reset assets twice, but it's just because our breakpoint is at the end of this for each loop, so it's just iterating over all of these. It didn't actually call this more than once, which I was worried about. I was like, what the heck? So let's just step over all of this and look at our final assets. And there we go. So I have all of these correctly grouped as we expected. And there we go. Let's go into our buy and let's purchase a stock. So let's just search something cheap. I think General Electric is GE, and that's pretty cheap. And there we go. Okay, 671. I just don't know how much money I have in my account. So let's go ahead and buy 3. And if we press buy, our assets get reset. And if we look at these, we now have 3 assets. We got our GE. We got 3 of them. So that is great. Now, one last thing I want to try out is I want to go into my database and put a sell transaction in the database. So let's go into our database, and this is the asset transactions table. Let's look at that data, and this is actually a cool use case. So now I have 2 purchases for DFS. I think that's like Discover Financial, and they're each 1 share. So let's go ahead and make this a sell like that, and now it's going to evaluate to 0 shares. And if something evaluates to 0 shares, I really don't need to display it, I don't think. So I think we could go ahead and update this grouping calculation right here and exclude everything where the shares are equal to 0. But what I want to do first is make sure that we correctly subtract shares. So we should get an asset view model in here with 0 shares. So there we go. Let's look at our assets. And there we go. So it does correctly subtract the shares. And what we need to do is we need to filter out the view models that have 0 shares, because we don't care about them. They don't actually own the asset. So the asset view model, we only want the view model if the shares are greater than 0. And there we go. Now we are only receiving those 2 shares because we don't want anything that has 0. And that is great. So we have this asset summary view model, super reactive. Actually, real quick, one thing I wanted to go over is I want to explain why this reset assets gets called and why this state changed gets raised whenever we buy a stock. And the reason for that is because if we look at our buy stock command, we actually take our account store and set the current account to the new account that has the new transaction. So once we set that current account, it raises the state changed, and our asset store is subscribed to that, and then the asset store raises state changed, and then we regrab those values. So if that was a little bit confusing, that is the reason why all these events are getting raised. It's because of this setter that we have right here. And actually, while I'm here, let's just freaking show a message box just to notify the user that the purchase was successful, because right now we do nothing and it's just confusing. Eventually we're going to have to improve our messaging and probably have loading prompts in our application, but for now this is good enough for a placeholder in my opinion. And that's actually where I'm going to pause for this episode. Next time we're going to be implementing UI to display this asset summary view model and put that on the homepage. Anyways, if you have any questions, criticisms, or concerns, be sure to leave a comment below in the comment section. But other than that, thank you for watching. I hope you guys learned something from this episode, and be sure to leave a like or subscribe for more. Thank you.